Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. And today we're going to be discussing a bit of a follow-up also to our previous discussion with our guest today, talking about Commonomics USA. We will be discussing all about the commons and really getting to know why this economy that we have not only in the US, but worldwide is not really working for the benefit of everyone else in terms of general public. And what this organization, Commonomics USA, is currently doing and is planning to take on as projects also this year to precisely let us know what is wrong with the current system and essentially empower ourselves to get back into a source of the economy that really benefits everyone. And that is completely possible, and we will get to know how today. So I welcome once again our guest, Matt Stannard, who is Commonomics USA Policy Director. So welcome to the Hangout.
It's so good to be back. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you. And to our viewers, I'd like to remind you that there will be questions, comments that you can place for Matt throughout the duration of this discussion, which will be around 40 minutes, more or less, depending also on questions and opening up several topics here. So, Matt, the movement of the commons has been in the airwaves, so to speak. But many times we don't have like a clear idea of what the commons are. So can we start through that very basic introduction? What are the commons?
Certainly, that's a very good question, and there's no absolute answer. There's no magic definition in the sky. Different groups and different individuals have different approaches. We typically talk about a threefold definition of the commons. One is the natural world. The other is the physical structural world that we build together as in order to advance public goods. So, on the one hand, you have the natural world, but on the other hand, you have things like post offices and water management systems and schools and things that are built for public use and public sharing as opposed to private ownership and private profit. And then the third is what a lot of people call the informational commons. For some, the digital commons is part of that, but that's our collective knowledge base that we build together and the systems we build together to preserve and share that knowledge. So the informational commons, the knowledge commons, the idea commons is what a lot of people say. The position of Commonomics USA is that when you really get down to it and when you really live an authentic relationship with the commons, you start to realize that almost everything is either part of the commons in a sense or derives from, and our wealth, whatever we define as our wealth, ultimately derives from the commons. And so it's a very radicalizing exercise to think about those definitions, because we start to say, well, that's almost everything. Unless people kind of rip it apart from its context and privatize it, we really share most of what we live in. And so that's why Commonomics USA is seeking to sort of re-authenticate our relationship with the commons in our policies and our laws and our cultural practices.
So in essence, how can we reclaim and grow them? Because we're talking about that everything that is here, it's kind of commonsensical that there was no tags explaining this belongs to this person or only a certain nation, things like that. That's like a broader notion that, yes, makes us exercise the notions of property and also control. So what can be done essentially in a system that is inherently designed to not allow this kind of realization or recognition of the commons as public good and for the benefit of everyone?
That's, again, a very good question, and a question that I could pontificate for 40 minutes, and I'll try not to do that so that we can actually have a conversation. One thing that we have come to realize, and I'm publishing a book this year called The American Commons, and part of that narrative is that for Americans, at least, this is, may not be contextual to every group or every nation, but Americans have been taught, my generation and the generation right before me in particular, were taught that the American experiment was largely one that was tailored to capitalism and privatization. That is not only not true, but that has not been the story that we've been told for the entire history of our nation. Really only in the last 40 years or so, this proliferation of libertarian think tanks and free market think tanks and right-wing knowledge generators have sort of put forward this myth that the American experiment is grounded in privatization and capitalism. The truth is that as everyone knows, the origin of America is much more complicated than that. Obviously, there were groups here who were displaced and subject to great injustice. There were groups that were imported as slave labor that we also have to contend with in our history. But even beyond that, the settlers, the early American settlers, were not all commerce people and businessmen. Many settlers came here to live cooperative, communal lives. And so there has always been a parallel of our treatment of the commons in America between those, or among those who would treat it as a private commodity to be bought and sold, and those who would treat it in a cooperative fashion. So things like worker cooperatives, trade unions, and communal communities, intentional communities, are part of American history from the very beginning. Part of what we're doing at Commonomics is also letting people know that the story of cooperative economics is the American story. It is part of the American story. It's been partially erased from history by right-wing think tanks, but we would like to reassert that. And we're not doing it ourselves. There are hundreds of intentional communities and hundreds of organizations who have kept that communal spirit alive. That is part of our history that we need to reclaim and put back in terms of the public narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I fully agree that when looking into other books that actually explain this hidden history, one realizes to what extent we are shaped in schools to not only ignore that side of history, but always be geared into this notion that the system has always been, capitalist in nature,
it's
and
the default. It's
war
that
profiteering,
exactly,
and that's it.
Exactly. No, it's the default, and that system of thought says, well, yeah, some people have experimented with communal living, and some people have experimented with cooperative economics, but that's the other. So there's this otherization, this sort of alienation of that part of our existence, which really, when you look at our own material history, and not only of America, but I think of the entire civilized world, we see that there has always been this parallel existence of privatizers versus cooperative economics, and they have existed in what I would call, sort of tension with one another, sometimes cooperatively, oftentimes the capital side of things, the privatization side of things, tends to have a predatory relationship to the cooperative side, and that's been really the source of the tension and the source of what some people would call the contradictions of capitalism. Is that capitalism tends to want to eat that which is not its own, and in order to keep growing. Whereas cooperative economics tends to be sustainable almost by its very nature. And so that predatory relationship is really one-sided. But those who are into cooperative economics are always trying to reassert and kind of push back and say, no, this is a viable way of living on the planet. And so to that extent, Commonomics USA and many other groups seek to encode our cooperative relationships in law and policy. So when we talk about things like public banking, when we talk about things like guaranteed basic income, when we talk about things like postal banking and ways that we can democratize our finances, and we talk about community agriculture and worker-owned cooperatives, all of those things are ways in which we seek to hardwire economic justice and cooperation into our everyday legal, policy, and cultural relationships.
I would say that that's actually the real meaning of economics. I mean, it comes from the word oikos, which is home, and the administration of that. What has happened also is what we've seen in mainstream economics, that it's mostly about this fictional system that it's has its particular rules that have no context with reality, with people, with communities at all. It's like a form of brainwashing that has happened to
it's metaphysical thinking. Yeah, it is. It's exactly. Metaphysical thinking, because and economists who are honest will admit this. They will say, yes, we have this notion of this abstract rational man who makes these choices in these very abstract ways, these rational choices in these very abstract and individualized ways. And that has been the governing assumption of bourgeois economic thought. And so a few years ago, a scholar named Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in economics for basically proving, much to the chagrin of traditional economists and the Chicago School, et cetera, for proving that not only can we live cooperatively, not only can we hold the commons in cooperative arrangements, but throughout much of history, that's exactly what we have done. And so I have a great deal of admiration for Elinor Ostrom for sort of sticking it to conventional economics and actually winning the Nobel Prize in economics for doing so and for rewriting that narrative. I think that that's crucial, because so many good-hearted people, so many well-intentioned people look at the things we want to do, like public banks and cooperative economics, and they say, that's a great idea, but we can't do that. That's not in human nature. And what Elinor Ostrom's work demonstrates, and what the experience of intentional communities all over the world demonstrates, is it is very much in our nature, and we have successfully been able to negotiate the commons with ourselves and with the world when we have been allowed to do so.
I consider that also this notion of, and you probably can expand on the concept of localized economies and the solidarity that emerges from it. This also threatens very much the centralized and governments and the system in itself, because, oh no, you don't want that organized community of people that can work in a very sustainable and fluent manner, because then you no longer need like the greater system. What's your perspective on this? And if you first can kind of explain to us what this localized economy would look like, what is it about?
Well, I think back to the very well-known historical reference of about 1649 in England, when a group of people called the Diggers went to St. George's Hill and established one of the first communes that we know of in modern history. And they lived in common, they shared things, they worked together, they ate together. There were many feminist elements of it, even though this was, still a very patriarchal culture in English culture. There were still, nevertheless, these very spiritual and feminine elements to what was being done, even among the men who were there. And they began to live successfully, the Diggers did. And of course, the propertied classes in England couldn't stand it. Even though they weren't directly threatened by the economic activities that the Diggers were performing, they nevertheless destroyed the Diggers' village because of the example that it was setting to the world. And then I think of the Paris Commune, where in the throes of war, the people of Paris were completely abandoned by their military and their government. Shopkeepers left, factory owners left, everybody escaped except for the working people of Paris. And they said, okay, we'll do this ourselves. We'll just run this place ourselves. And again, strong feminist elements, women's emancipation was part of this, universal emancipation, communal living. And of course, the rest of the world couldn't stand it. There was even an editorial in one of the New York newspapers at the time saying, this is the most dangerous thing that we can possibly imagine, that these people in Paris are living on their own without the forces of capital and without the forces of imperialism. We have to crush them. And, you know, I've been to the Communards Wall at the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, where, you know, after the soldiers came back, they put each and every one of the communist leaders, the communal leaders, up against the wall, and they executed them because the world of capital was terrified at the example that was being set. And that example is replicated all the time, all over the world, in these intentional communities who, through trial and error, try to share their resources in different ways, different schemes. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but they keep trying. There is this persistence in the human communal spirit that has caused groups of people over the ages to try to live that way. So there's many historical examples. And then alongside of that, what we try to do at Commonomics USA, and again, we're not alone in doing this, many other groups are doing it too, we try to say, okay, what policies and laws facilitate this cooperation? What policies and laws can we enact both on a local level as well as on a national level to facilitate local sustainable economic justice? And of course, now in the age of this disastrous climate change that we have brought upon ourselves, we also have to do something that we call at our materialized empathy project at Commonomics USA, we call it climate egalitarianism, which is this notion that cooperative economics also has to reflect the fact that the way we treat the planet and the way we treat one another are intimately related together.
Absolutely, and that we, within the current status quo that we're living in, it's absolutely unsustainable. And it seems that all the laws and, you know, with these trade deals as well, wherein there is zero respect for human beings, there's zero respect for resources, all of this is a part of what is essentially decimating almost any possibility for everything that you're mentioning. So also another point that I'm seeing is if we look at the root of, you know, the commons, communism, and the whole propaganda system that existed for various decades now in the US specifically, everything tagging this as a danger, as you were mentioning. So I understand that Commonomics USA is an organization that is precisely gearing yourselves to start dissipating this kind of false notions of it. Can you expand a little bit also on your aim within this context of, let's say, the misunderstandings that people have about commons, maybe linking it to communism and having these wrong ideas? What's the kind of clarifications that you usually have to give in this case?
I think that the best argument against that sort of hyper-individualistic propaganda is to see simply the numerous examples of when cooperation works. There are many examples of when it works in our everyday lives, examples in particular of local government. I think the interesting thing about working with local governments is we've worked with people on all sides of the political spectrum, but if they're local officials, a lot of times they tend to be open to ideas about shared resources that sometimes national politicians and certainly multinational corporations are not as open to. They're just looking for ways to make things work. I like to tell a story of many friends, very dear friends that I have, who composed the Green Party majority of the city of Fairfax, California, in the 2000s and even beyond, they were able, as part of that Green Party majority city council in Fairfax, California, as well as activists all through Marin County in California, they were able to pass a historic zero waste ordinance, a set of historic zero waste ordinances and systems that were really the cutting edge of the entire country in terms of that. And those Green Party officials tell me that they did that with the help of Republican politicians in city councils across Marin County. They said actually it was in some cases easier to work with the Republican city officials than it was to work with the Democratic city officials. And I think that the reason for that is, I think the closer you are to the action, the closer you are to those material interactions, even if you're a business person, even if you have a small business, you tend to be very open to ideas of sustainability. So a lot of this is local. Of course, we emphasize some national policies too. Postal banking, if it happens, is going to have to be a federal policy in the United States because the Postal Service is a federal policy. And certainly basic income guarantees probably can't work at local levels, because if some communities give basic income and others don't, then you have very uncomfortable migration things occurring. And so probably, although you can experiment with those things, I think, on a local level, you know, some of that is going to have to be national. But I think any national policy that you're talking about has to be done with the intent in mind of empowering local communities. And agriculture, of course, is a huge example of this too. There are many United Nations reports and studies, for example, that people cite that say the only way we're truly going to solve hunger and feeding the world is by empowering local communities to do local sustainable agriculture. And so I think I think we're seeing not necessarily a de-evolution to the purely local. I think what we're seeing is a synthesis of local policies with complementary national policies that share information and share networking at a national and even global level, but do so in the service of empowering local communities to live sustainably. That's the type of picture or the type of world that we'd like to see. Not little enclaves where, you know, people have their little fiefdoms or anything, but rather a synthesis of global cooperation with local sustainability.
I definitely agree on that because, you know, as you were mentioning just now, when you only have certain communities doing their thing, but kind of isolating themselves to looking at the bigger picture, it creates a rift as well. And we also very much talk about that sense of responsibility that we have, not only to our local communities, but also in this global consciousness of, yes, if we empower ourselves at a local level, at a national level, then we start opening our interdependence with other countries, because nowadays it's kind of inevitable to blind ourselves to the notion that we're trading and we eat things that come from everywhere else. But I very much like this idea of beginning first with oneself, recognizing this sense of localized economy, and then from there looking at what can be done at a national level in this case. We have a question from Rep Dalmas, and she's saying, interesting, could we say that through belief systems there is a friction between communal actions and capital use? After all, is not capital the resources used to create value?
Well, capital is one way of conceiving about the resources that are used to create value. I think public banking is a great example of how we move beyond that. Because I think that it's an example of moving from shareholder economies to stakeholder economies. In a shareholder economy, we assume that in order to start a project or in order to start doing something, it has to be capitalized by shareholders. But in cooperative economics, we see that there are other ways to capitalize or other ways to begin projects, including ways of raising money. Sometimes that is definitely through social entrepreneurship, but other times it can be simply through the collectivization of resources. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. But I think it is a value question, certainly in many ways. It begs the question of what is the source of all value? Is the source of all value capital that is manufactured through only individual initiative and extraction and exploitation? Or is there another way to conceive of valuation which is more sustainable and more in touch, not only with our relationship to the planet, but with our shared vulnerability? And so there are different ways to do that. And some of those ways are syntheses of private and public works. And we recognize that there's a place for that. What we seek to move beyond is the notion that extraction and exploitation is the way that we finance things and the way that we finance ourselves. Because humans right now, too much, have an extractive and exploitative relationship, not only with the planet, but also with one another. Once we move beyond the notion that the only way that I can enrich myself is to extract surplus value from you, then all kinds of things become possible. And those things work. North Dakota's public bank works. Cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives, have a far greater success rate than conventional businesses. I think we need to ask ourselves, why is it that those collective endeavors, when they actually are given a chance to work, actually work and fail at a much lesser rate than private capitalist endeavors do?
Yeah, I would also add to that maybe the point is not to seeing capital or even the word in itself as something wrong, but more in the ways in which things are used, including human beings, resources, in this moderation and consideration of what is sustainable, what is for common benefit, what is not merely for the sake of getting the money out of it, because that has become like the ways around our economy currently.
Exactly.
So thanks, Rep, for your question. If there are many other questions that you guys may have, please place them in the question app in the Google event. So let's continue with our discussion. You mentioned postal banking. Can you explain to us what it is, how it works?
Mm-hmm. I think that if any of our international listeners or viewers will already know how it works, because a huge amount of the global population does bank through their postal service. And in the United States, until roughly 1967, that is what we did here, or we had a postal bank from, I think, 1911 to 1967. And older people, older Americans that I talk to say, yeah, I remember the postal bank. And again, it's a public bank because it's owned by a public entity. Post offices in America tend to be in the heart of communities. Right now, in many of those communities, there are no accessible banking services. And so many people in those communities, in marginalized communities, and poor people are forced to deal with payday lenders, and check cashers and pawn organizations and auto title loan organizations, particularly if they have a financial emergency. And statistically, almost 50% of the American people, this is a shocking statistic, so I invite your viewers to really hear it. Almost 50% of the American population right now could not survive a $500 emergency. A $500 emergency would be more than almost half the population have. They don't have, many of the population don't have savings. That's not because they're lazy. It's not because they're lazy or immoral or anything like that. I mean, if you want to make that judgment on half of the population, be my guest. I don't think it's a constructive way of looking at the world, but it's because, as we know, as anyone reading an economics textbook would know, real wages have declined, savings has declined, interest rates on finance have gone up, and so that money has literally been exploited and sucked away from a huge portion of the population. So one of the functions of a postal bank would be to be able to make payday advances and small loans available to people, to the same target population that these payday lenders go after. But instead of 300 or more % interest, which is what these predatory payday lenders charge, just ruining lives to do that, ruining the lives of domestic violence victims and others in the system. Instead of that, a postal bank could get away with charging much, much lower interest. And even if there is some, because both entities have to deal with the fact that there's going to be some defaults, there's going to be people that can't afford to pay. Of course, it's easier to pay if the interest rate is lower. And a public lending institution could insure itself against any portion of that base that might default on those things. That's just your basic business practices of banking, but instead of charging 300 or more % interest, you're charging much, much lower interest rates. That's going to improve the quality of people's lives in numerous ways. I was on an interview yesterday when I talked about the difference between a domestic violence victim in Denmark and one in the United States. If you are a domestic violence victim in Denmark, you have a relatively, comparatively easier path to emancipation and empowerment, because you are getting a living wage, you are guaranteed employment if you need employment, or you will be taken care of in lieu of that employment. You will get rehoused. You have all sorts of access to public value that is ours. We do that to take care of each other, is the philosophy of those types of economic systems. You can call them capitalist, socialist, I don't care what you call them. They have a public dividend available to people that is a route to safety. Whereas I worked in domestic violence response agency and shelter for a couple of years in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and it was awful. There was no route to financial empowerment for victims who are in poverty. And so they end up many times stuck in those abusive situations. I think that is such a great living example of the difference between a society that takes care of people and a society that doesn't. And I think that that is a difference worth fighting for with every fiber of our being.
Absolutely. And also being able to prove wrong the kind of headlines and ideas that we formed about those countries, like, oh, they spend so much money on giving these great lives to people. These kind of opinions that really don't go into looking at the benefits of how people live there and how it affects them.
Amazingly enough, businesses thrive in Denmark and other countries. Denmark has the most business-friendly atmosphere actually in Europe, and does one of the better jobs taking care of people. Now, I want to say those societies are not perfect, and where they go wrong, the people there have just as much of a right and responsibility to protest and push. None of that was given to them for free. Those were all in response to collective public demands and collective public actions. So I'm not saying that they're utopias. I'm saying that the working class in those countries has advanced to a point and pushed to a point where they have successfully demanded those types of resources be socialized, essentially. And we believe that there are mechanisms for us to do that here. We are up against tremendous cultural and intellectual barriers in doing so, but we continue to fight that fight because we believe that acknowledging our shared needs and our shared vulnerability and our shared connection to the commons is really what's necessary to save not only our planet, but to save each other, to save ourselves.
Absolutely agree on that in terms of the barriers at a cultural, educational level. These type of concepts have been essentially erased from a child's mentality, and essentially reinforcing the usual individuality versus the benefit of the group and team effort. And all the results that can emerge with this. I would like to ask you if money could be then considered as part of the commons and money creation in itself.
Absolutely. That's such a good question, and it gets to the heart of the difference between a public banking system, which we would like to see in place, and private banking. Obviously there are small community banks that are integral to their communities, but we've also seen what the big banks can do. Tremendous, horrible damage to the population. And the reason for that is that we have conceived of the creation of money and the circulation of money as a private commodity rather than a public utility. So what I like to do when I talk to people about public banking is I say, you have the roads and you have businesses on the roads. Money and the financial system is much more like a road than it is like a business. We should treat it as such because money only exists as money. Money only has value because of the collective acknowledgement that it does. And so it's a public utility. It's not something that ought to be privatized. And the idea that we not only hoard money, but we sell money for more money has been, in my opinion, the root of a lot of really, really bad problems. And that's why in systems like Islamic banking and in various communal systems that we have seen, the idea of no interest loans or extremely low interest loans is seen as a public good because money itself and the financial system itself in those systems is seen as a public good.
I would like to also add to this that these kind of concepts are something that you guys, because of perceiving the barriers at a cultural level and acknowledging these basic concepts, you have put out a game. Is this so?
Yes.
Can you share
also
about
called
it? A
the
board
American
game.
Commons. Yes, it's also called the American Commons, and it was designed by our president, Mark Armstrong. And people can order it at the site. It's sort of the anti-monopoly game. It's not the only game of its kind. There have been others in the past that other groups have made that have been equally delightful in my mind, and that is the object of the game is to cooperate. The object of the game, you win if you cooperate right in that type of game, as opposed to winning by extracting from everyone else, which is how you win at Monopoly. And me and my kids love to play Monopoly, but we know that we're playing a game and that it's a game that rewards ruthlessness, whereas the American Commons, which you can order from commonomicsusa.org, rewards competitors for cooperating. We like the idea that maybe we're doing our tiny little part in reshaping our competitive culture in doing that. And so also along the way, you can read the information that's on the cards in the game that tells about the history of the commons and the history of both cooperation and the times that we have failed to adequately cooperate and we've privatized the commons. So it's also a really good way of introducing people to that concept of privatization, which is something that on a policy level we are fighting against at Commonomics USA. We would like to see the end of privatizing water and privatizing our watersheds. We've seen horrible effects of that all over the place. We'd like to see an end to trade agreements that reward privatization and neoliberalism at the expense of the public good. So those are values that we put forward in our policies, and we're very excited about the game putting forward those values as well.
I think that material like this and interviews and more programs, which I understand that your organization is also planning to do, are needed precisely to keep sharing and making it more normal and acceptable to think this way, because it really is all about making these kind of conversations also, especially with children. I would very much like that kind of game also to be translated to other languages if possible, to make it a perfect gift as a way of saying, look, I want you to be entertained with the notion of winning is sharing. I mean, that's really great. Mm-hmm. So thank you for doing that. And
absolutely. Yeah. It's very exciting. Philanthropy and charity are great, but that's not economic justice. because philanthropy, charity, even traditional liberal redistributive economics all rely on a hierarchy and preserve that hierarchy that makes the powerless dependent on the powerful. And so while I admire people that are philanthropic, and I admire charity, and many organizations I work with rely on charity and rely on redistribution, we need to rebuild our economy from the ground up to hardwire cooperation and economic justice in our local communities so that we are not constantly dependent on the goodwill of others. That instead we build that goodwill and hardwire it in our organic systems themselves. We think that worker-owned cooperatives, public banks, basic income dividends, various ways of collectivizing our material insecurities and securities is the way to do that.
Absolutely. And I would like you to share also, to finalize the hangout, about the projects that you have for this year. I understand that there is also a campaign in relation to these materialized projects. So can you share about it?
Certainly. So a few things that are coming out of Commonomics USA this year. First is our ongoing campaign for postal banking. We have successfully passed mayor's resolutions at the National Conference of Mayors in the past. We are also working with a coalition for postal banking that includes the National Association of Letter Carriers and the American Postal Workers Union and other groups like ours. So postal banking is very much going to be at the forefront of our activities. We're also going to continue our education on basic income. Switzerland is doing a referendum this year on basic income. Other countries are actually going to implement pilot programs on basic income. We are going to help other organizations promote that idea in the United States. So basic income is another one. And then we have the Materialized Empathy Project, which is a specific law and policy project in which we will take ideas like public banks, other sustainable economic activities, worker-owned cooperatives, the rights of the economic rights of the incarcerated and ex-incarcerated, and socioeconomic rights in general. And what we will do is assist local communities and local grassroots organizations in writing laws, actually writing laws and policies that encode those cooperative arrangements into their legal systems and into their community ordinances. And so, again, materializing empathy, because it is not enough to simply feel empathy towards one another in our hearts. We actually need policies and laws that hardwire that empathy into our systems. And of course, climate egalitarianism is another part of that, because you can't tell entire communities that have been producing coal and oil for years that they suddenly just have to stop, and we're not going to help them through that transition. Those communities will naturally push back. And that's what we're seeing in this transition to a post-carbon economy. So that empathy must also be shared with those communities who are affected by this inevitable transition that we're going through. So those are all some things that you're going to be able to see. And of course, we're on Facebook and Twitter as well. We have commonomicsusa.org that folks can visit. And if they have questions for me personally, they can email me at matt@commonomicsusa.org, and I'm happy to answer questions, invite people to conversations, and to continue to foster dialogue on these ideas.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for being here on a second time. And I would like to remind our viewers that we had Matt previously talking about public banking as well. So we will leave a link to that if you want to watch that first one, so that you can get the sort of like the second part here with Commonomics, and also to ask you very rapidly as a final point: is there a way in which people from around the world, including myself, can get into this organization, or are there any other organizations that you recommend looking at if we are outside of the US?
Certainly, our membership, our supporters can certainly be outside of the United States. We've never discouraged that. Most of the policy projects we do, I mean, our name is Commonomics USA, so many of the policy projects that we do are going to be US focused. But if someone emails me and says, hey, Matt, I love your ideas. Are there groups in my own country that are facilitating those ideas? I will make every effort, and we will make every effort to get people in touch with those groups. Ultimately, we know that economic justice and ecological justice are international endeavors. I think that part of the global democratic, socialist, and other movements over the years has always recognized that. So, we want to foster internationalism while each of us in our own countries can do things to change our local and national laws. So
thank you very
email me.
much.
Yeah.
Great. We will leave all the links, your email in the description of this video. Thank you very much for being here, Matt.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me back.
Absolutely great to have you here. And thanks to you, the viewer, as well for watching. Remember that if you didn't catch the live broadcast of this Hangout, you can still leave comments, questions for Matt in the YouTube video as a comment, and we will make sure that he gets it. So see you next time, and bye, Matt.
Thank you very much.